I am Chloe Sterling, 32 years old and a federal forensic auditor. 2 nights ago, I walked into my mother's 60th birthday gala wearing a tailored suit instead of a ball gown. My father stormed across the marble floor, grabbed my arm, and slapped me across the face in front of 300 elite guests. My mother leaned in and whispered for me to leave through the side door before I ruined their reputation. I did not move. Before I could even wipe the blood from my lip, Judge Bradley Kensington stood up from the VIP table, slammed his champagne flute down, and asked my father one simple question. "Do you know who she is, Richard? Before I tell you what happened next, hit the like button and subscribe. If you believe the truth always catches up to those who hide it, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Let us go straight into that ballroom. The Sterling estate in Greenwich is designed to intimidate. Vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with portraits of people who bought their way into history. I stepped through the double oak doors at exactly 8 o'clock. The string quartet was playing something classical. Waiters in white coats drifted through the crowd carrying silver trays of caviar. I spotted them immediately near the center ice sculpture, Richard and Vivian Sterling holding court. My father noticed me first. His smile vanished. He handed his drink to a passing waiter, excused himself from a state senator, and marched toward me. The heavy thud of his shoes on the marble floor made the guests nearest to us turn their heads. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask why I had returned after 8 years of silence. He stopped inches from my face. His breath smelled of expensive scotch and cigars. "How dare you sneak in here?" The words were a low growl meant only for me, but the slap that followed was meant for an audience. The impact snapped my head to the side. A sharp, stinging heat spread across my left cheek. The string quartet faltered. The low hum of networking died instantly. 300 pairs of eyes locked onto us. My mother materialized beside him. Her silk gown rustled against the floor. She did not check if I was hurt. She grabbed my elbow. Her manicured nails dug into my skin. "Get out through the side door, Chloe." Her voice was a frantic hiss. "Do not embarrass this family tonight. The valet will bring your car." I tasted copper. I reached up and wiped a drop of blood from the corner of my mouth. I looked at the smear of red on my thumb, then back at the 2 people who had spent my entire life teaching me that loyalty meant taking the blame for their sins. I opened my mouth to speak, but a chair scraped loudly against the floorboards at table 1. Judge Bradley Kensington, a federal district judge my father had spent months trying to court for zoning favors, stood to his full height. He picked up his crystal champagne flute and brought it down hard on the table. The sharp crack echoed against the vaulted ceiling. Everyone flinched. My father turned. His face shifted from rage to practiced diplomacy in a fraction of a second. "Bradley," my father said. Forcing a smile, "I apologize for the disruption. This is just a private family matter." Judge Kensington ignored him. He buttoned his suit jacket, kept his eyes locked on my father, and stepped away from the table. The silence in the room felt suffocating. No one dared to breathe. Kensington stopped halfway between the VIP table and the doorway. He looked at my father with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "A private family matter," Kensington repeated. His voice carried across the room steady and cold. "Richard, you just laid hands on a federal officer. Do you even know who she is?" My father stood paralyzed. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly gray pallor beneath his country club tan. He looked at Judge Kensington, then back at me. His mind raced as he tried to categorize the threat standing in front of him. For 8 years, he had successfully sold a specific narrative to every person in our social circle. I was the tragic flaw in an otherwise pristine family tapestry. He had repeated the lie so many times, I suspect he had started to believe it himself. He forced a hollow laugh. It was a sharp, desperate sound that echoed awkwardly across the ballroom. "Judge," he said, holding his hands up in a placating gesture, "I think there is a misunderstanding. Chloe has struggled with substance abuse for years. She is prone to delusions. We have tried getting her help, but she refuses treatment. It is a heartbreak for us all. She should not even be here." I watched my sister Harper step out from the crowd. She wore a sapphire evening gown that probably cost more than my first car. Her hands clutched a beaded purse. Harper was 2 years older, the media director of Sterling Investments, and the golden child who could do no wrong. She practiced her best sympathetic pout. It was the exact same expression she used when cameras were rolling at charity events. "Oh," Chloe Harper murmured, taking a slow, cautious step toward me. "Please let us get you to a hospital. You are having an episode. We just want you to be safe." My pulse slowed. The anger that had burned my cheek faded into a cold, hyper-focused calm. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the glasses at the bar. "An episode," I repeated. The word hung in the chilled air. "Is that what we are calling it now, Harper? Because 8 years ago, when $500,000 vanished from the corporate escrow account, you did not call it an episode. You called it a mistake." Harper stopped dead in her tracks. Her sympathetic pout shattered. She glanced at our father, panic flashing in her eyes. She took a step backward, bumping into a waiter. I turned my attention to the crowd of investors, politicians, and socialites. "Let me clarify the family history my father loves to share," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the marble floor. 8 years ago, my sister embezzled $500,000 to cover gambling debts and a string of bad offshore investments. When the internal auditors noticed the discrepancy, my father brought me into his office. He locked the door. He handed me a pre-written confession and a pen. He told me that if I did not take the blame, Harper would go to federal prison and the resulting scandal would destroy the company. My mother Vivian pressed her trembling hand over her mouth. I refused to sign it. I continued maintaining eye contact with the crowd. So my father forged my signature on the internal disciplinary documents, terminated my employment, and locked me out of my own trust fund. He then told this entire town I developed a severe drug habit and ran away. A brilliant strategy, really. Who would believe a disgraced addict over a respected CEO? It was the perfect exile to protect his favorite child. "Shut your mouth!" Richard roared. The veneer of the concerned patriarch dissolved. His face flushed a dark, dangerous purple. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You are a liar and a thief. I will not let you walk into my home and spew this garbage to my guests." He spun around, searching the perimeter of the room. "Donovan!" he shouted, barking the name of his head of private security. "Donovan, get over here right now. Drag this woman out of my house and throw her off the property. If she resists, call the local precinct and have her arrested for trespassing." Donovan, a broad-shouldered man in a dark tailored suit, stepped forward from the shadows near the terrace doors. 4 other armed guards flanked him. They moved in perfect unison, boots heavy against the floorboards. My father smirked, confident that his wealth still commanded the room. He adjusted his silk tie, waiting for the physical removal of his problem. But Donovan did not reach for my arm. He did not issue a command to his men. He stopped 5 feet away, folded his hands in front of him, and planted his feet firmly on the ground. The other guards mirrored his stance. They formed a silent wall, not to escort me out, but to observe. My father blinked. The smirk vanished from his lips. "Did you hear me, Donovan?" he demanded, his voice cracking with outrage. "I said throw her out. You work for me. Do your job, or I will fire every single one of you before the night is over." Donovan kept his eyes forward, his expression neutral. "I am doing my job, sir," he replied evenly. I watched my father realize that the invisible strings he used to pull the world around him had been cut. Confusion morphed into sheer panic. He took a step toward Donovan, raising a fist. "I pay your salary, you insubordinate fool." "Actually, Richard," I interrupted, slipping my hand into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket. "You do not." I withdrew a folded document. The thick parchment paper bore the unmistakable raised seal of the United States District Court. A bright red stamp glared from the top right corner. I unfolded it deliberately, letting the crisp rustle of the paper fill the dead air of the ballroom. As of 7 o'clock this evening, I announced holding the document out so the front row of guests could see the federal insignia. You do not pay anyone's salary. You do not have access to a single corporate account line of credit or offshore holding." My father stared at the red seal. His breathing turned shallow and erratic. "What is that?" he choked out. "What did you do?" "I am no longer the scapegoat you threw away 8 years ago," I stated, my tone clinical and detached. "I spent those years earning 2 degrees in forensic accounting. I work for the federal government investigating white-collar financial crimes. And earlier today, a federal judge signed this order based on 300 pages of evidence I personally gathered against Sterling Investments." I stepped closer to him, closing the distance. He shrank back. "I am the court-appointed receiver," I said, enunciating every syllable. "The Department of Justice placed me in full control of your entire empire. Every dollar that flows in or out of your firm requires my signature. Your assets are frozen. Your corporate credit cards are suspended. Even the caterers serving the caviar tonight will have to submit an invoice to my office for approval tomorrow morning." A collective gasp rippled through the 300 guests. These were not just friends enjoying a birthday party. They were shareholders, board members, and silent partners who had entrusted millions to the Sterling name. The realization hit them like a physical blow. If the federal government had appointed a receiver, it meant the company was under active investigation for fraud. It meant their money was trapped in a federal freeze. My mother swayed on her feet, clutching the edge of a cocktail table to stay upright. Harper backed away, hiding behind a group of bewildered guests, attempting to shrink into the background and escape the glaring lights. My father opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. The man who had commanded boardrooms and dictated my worth was reduced to a gasping shell. He looked at Donovan, then at the red stamp on the court order, and finally at Judge Kensington, who simply nodded in affirmation. The legal trap had snapped shut, and he was caught right in the teeth of it. The ballroom erupted. The dignified silence dissolved into a chaotic frenzy of panicked murmurs and frantic questions. Cell phones appeared as wealthy investors rushed to text their brokers and legal counsel. The lavish birthday gala had instantly transformed into a crime scene in the eyes of the elite. But my father was not the only one fighting for survival. Through the panicked crowd, a man pushed his way forward. His tailored tuxedo caught the light, and his jaw was set in a tight, furious line. Marcus Jefferson, my brother-in-law, and the vice president of operations stepped into the clearing. Unlike my father, Marcus did not yell. He understood that yelling was a sign of weakness. He preferred a different kind of warfare. The ballroom remained caught in a paralyzing grip of murmurs and frantic texting. My father stood near the overturned chair, breathing heavily, incapable of formulating a coherent sentence. His empire was fracturing in real time. But a corporate machine like Sterling Investments does not rely on just one man to handle a crisis. It relies on the people hired to clean up the mess. Footsteps cut through the chaotic noise. They were steady and measured. Marcus Jefferson stepped into the clearing separating my father from the panicked crowd. Marcus was 35 years old, a man who had built his reputation on maintaining a flawless exterior. As vice president of operations and Harper husband, he was the polished face the board of directors sent to handle hostile takeovers and media scandals. He wore a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that contrasted sharply with the sudden disarray of the room. His posture radiated an effortless authority. Marcus came from a working-class background, overcoming immense odds to secure his MBA and a corner office. He married into the Sterling family, believing he had cemented his legacy. He tolerated my father's arrogant demands and Harper's endless vanity because they provided him with unparalleled access to power. To Marcus, I was nothing more than an inconvenient ghost from a past they rarely discussed. He did not shout. He understood that raising his voice would only validate the panic spreading among the guests. Instead, he buttoned his jacket and offered a reassuring smile to the investors hovering near the terrace. "Please, everyone," Marcus said, his baritone voice washing over the crowd like a soothing balm. "There is no need for alarm. Take a breath. Enjoy your drinks. We are handling this." He turned his attention to me. The warm smile he gave the shareholders vanished, replaced by a chilling, patronizing stare. Marcus was a formidable opponent. He had clawed his way up the corporate ladder, relying on his sharp intellect and an uncanny ability to read the room. He married my sister, not just for love, but for a permanent seat at the executive table. He looked at me, not as a federal auditor, but as a stray dog that had wandered into his pristine headquarters. "Chloe," he began, shaking his head with a practiced look of disappointment. "It is truly tragic to see you like this. We all hoped you had found peace in whatever life you chose after you left us, but crashing your mother's birthday to stage a theatrical stunt. This is a new low even for you." He took 2 steps closer, bridging the gap between us. His eyes scanned the court order I still held in my hand. He let out a soft, dismissive chuckle. "I do not know what kind of forged document you printed off the internet," he continued, raising his voice, just enough to ensure the VIP tables could hear every syllable. "But playing pretend with federal insignia is a serious offense. You walk in here spewing wild accusations about fraud and receivership. You think you can rattle our shareholders with a piece of paper." I kept my stance relaxed. I did not interrupt him. Let the man speak, I thought. Let him tie the noose tight. "Our legal team is on standby," Marcus warned, folding his arms across his chest. "They are the top litigators on the East Coast. If you do not turn around and walk out those doors right now, I will personally ensure they file a civil suit for criminal defamation before the sun comes up. We will bury you under mountains of litigation. You will spend the rest of your life paying off the damages for the panic you attempted to incite tonight." He leaned in closer, dropping his volume so only I could hear the venom in his tone. "You are out of your depth, little sister. You think you can outsmart a billion-dollar firm. You are nothing but a disgruntled runaway trying to extort your family. Leave now or I will make sure the police haul you away in handcuffs for fraud." The guests watched us holding their collective breath. The dynamic in the room shifted. Marcus had successfully planted a seed of doubt. The investors wanted to believe him. They wanted to believe their portfolios were safe, and that the woman standing in the tailored suit was just a bitter, estranged relative putting on a desperate show. It was a brilliant pivot, transitioning the narrative from a federal raid back to a sad domestic dispute. He waited for my reaction. He expected me to argue. He expected me to raise my voice, defend my credentials, or lose my temper. That was the response of a victim. I was not a victim. I looked at Marcus and let a faint smile touch the corners of my mouth. I did not raise my voice to match his theatrics. I reached into the slim leather briefcase slung over my shoulder. The crisp sound of a zipper sliding open drew his gaze downward. I pulled out a thin manila folder. It did not hold a stack of dramatic evidence. It held exactly 3 pages of forensic bank logs. "You always were a fantastic speaker, Marcus," I said, my tone conversational and devoid of malice. "Your ability to soothe a room is exactly why my father promoted you to Vice President of Operations. You handle the logistics. You authorize the transfers. You make sure the gears keep turning while Richard shakes hands at the country club." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. He did not retreat, but his jaw tightened. "But that is the problem with being the operations guy," I continued. "When the gears stop turning, you are the one left standing in the engine room holding the wrench." I flipped open the manila folder. I bypassed the first 2 pages of summary reports and went straight to page 3. I held the folder out, extending it directly into his line of sight. Marcus refused to look at first. He kept his eyes locked on mine, trying to maintain his dominance. "Read it, Marcus," I said softly. "Just page 3. His eyes finally darted down to the document. The page contained a highly classified ledger detailing the movement of capital over the past 14 months. It was a sterile grid of dates, account routing numbers, and authorization codes. "You are looking at a sequence of wire transfers," I explained, keeping my voice steady. $50 million routed from the Sterling Employee Pension Fund into a series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. Marcus scoffed, trying to brush it off. "Anyone can type up a spreadsheet, Chloe. Look at the far right column," I instructed, ignoring his interruption. His eyes scanned across the grid. The ambient light of the chandelier illuminated the stark black ink on the page. His gaze stopped abruptly. The defiant sneer resting on his lips faltered. The rhythmic, confident rise and fall of his chest hitched. "Those are cryptographic authorization signatures," I said, watching the exact moment the truth pierced his armor. In a digital banking system, every outgoing wire requires an executive token, a unique digital fingerprint that traces back to a specific corporate officer. Marcus stared at the string of alphanumeric characters. The healthy glow of his skin faded into a sickly ashen hue. His broad shoulders stiffened. The man who had just threatened to bury me in litigation looked as if the floor had vanished beneath his feet. "Those are your digital signatures, Marcus," I whispered, leaning in so only he could hear the death knell of his career. "Every single one of those fraudulent offshore transfers was authorized using your executive credentials, your token, your password, your unique corporate identity." He swallowed hard. His eyes darted frantically across the page, desperately searching for an error, a typo, a discrepancy he could exploit. There was none. The forensic audit was airtight. The confident facade he had worn moments ago shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He realized he was not looking at a forged document. He was looking at his own digital execution. The gravity of the situation pressed down on him. Marcus knew the inner workings of federal investigations. He understood that paper trails of this magnitude do not materialize out of thin air. They require subpoenas, federal warrants, and months of painstaking digital forensic tracking. The document in his hands was not a mere spreadsheet. It was an indictment waiting for a gavel to fall. I closed the folder with a soft snap. The sound made him flinch. He looked up at me. The arrogant executive was gone. In his place stood a terrified man realizing he was standing squarely on a trap door with the lever pulled. Marcus slowly turned his head. He looked past me, locking eyes with his wife Harper, who was still cowering near the edge of the crowd. He then looked at my father Richard, who was watching the exchange with a cold, detached stare. The gears in Marcus' head finally engaged, clicking into a horrific realization. He had not just authorized those transfers. Someone else had used his credentials to do it. The next layer of the nightmare was about to pull him under. Marcus stood frozen. The bespoke midnight blue tuxedo suddenly looked too tight around his shoulders. He stared at the closed manila folder in my hand, as if it contained a live explosive. The silence between us stretched tight and thin. I could practically hear the calculations grinding inside his head. He knew he had never authorized those transfers. He knew his security token was kept locked in a biometric safe inside his home office. The only person who had access to that safe, the only person who knew his bypass codes, was his wife. I watched the realization dawn on him. It was a brutal thing to witness. The moment a man understands his entire life is built on a foundation of betrayal. "I did not approve those transactions," Marcus whispered. His voice was hoarse, stripped of all its former baritone authority. "I know you did not, Marcus," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. The FBI Cybercrimes Division tracked the origin of the authorization protocols. While the digital signatures belong to you, the IP addresses associated with those specific logins do not match your corporate terminal or your mobile devices. I took a slow step back, giving him space to process the fatal blow. Every single one of those $50 million in offshore wire transfers originated from a secure residential IP address. I continued loud enough for the closest investors to hear. The IP address assigned to the private network at your primary residence in Westchester, specifically from a custom-built desktop registered to the Director of Media Relations. Marcus turned his head slowly. The movement was stiff, robotic. He looked across the expanse of the marble floor toward his wife. Harper was leaning against a marble pillar, gripping her beaded purse so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked like a cornered animal trapped by the glare of the crystal chandeliers. For 8 years, Harper had played the role of the immaculate heiress. She graced the covers of local society magazines, hosted charity galas, and gave keynote speeches on corporate integrity. She was the golden child, the untouchable daughter who could seamlessly navigate the cutthroat world of New York finance without breaking a sweat. In reality, she was reckless. She covered her incompetence by stealing ideas from her subordinates, and when that was not enough, she stole money to fund a lifestyle she could not legitimately afford. Harper Marcus said, his voice trembling with a terrifying, restrained fury. "What did you do?" Harper flinched as if struck. She glanced wildly at our father seeking rescue. Richard, however, remained rooted to his spot next to the ice sculpture, his face a mask of furious calculation. He was already distancing himself from the impending wreckage. Marcus did not wait for his father-in-law to intervene. He marched across the ballroom, tearing through the crowd of stunned socialites. Guests scrambled out of his way, parting like the Red Sea. He reached Harper and grabbed her by the arm, pulling her away from the pillar. "Did you use my credentials?" Marcus demanded, ignoring the 300 guests watching their perfect marriage implode. "Did you log into the terminal and authorize those offshore wires?" Harper ripped her arm out of his grasp. She staggered back, her sapphire gown swishing loudly against the floor. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her mascara with practiced precision. Within seconds, her breathing turned rapid and shallow. She placed a hand against her chest, a picture of fragile distress. "How can you ask me that?" Harper cried out, her voice vibrating with faux anguish. "Are you actually listening to her? Chloe has hated me since we were teenagers. She has always been jealous of my success, my life, our marriage. This is a setup." She turned to face the crowd of investors, spreading her arms in a theatrical display of vulnerability. "Please, you have to believe me. Chloe was committed to a rehabilitation center years ago because she could not handle reality. She fabricated these documents to destroy my family. She is trying to tear my husband and me apart because she has nothing of her own." The ballroom erupted in a renewed wave of anxious whispers. Harper was deploying the same tactic our father had used for nearly a decade: deflect, deny, and pathologize the accuser. She played the weeping victim flawlessly. Her tears were genuine, but they were tears of self-preservation, not sorrow. Several prominent investors exchanged uneasy glances. The narrative was muddying. A federal court order was a tangible threat, but a bitter family feud involving a supposedly unstable sister presented a plausible counter-narrative. The elite crowd preferred a messy domestic dispute over a corporate fraud scandal that jeopardized their portfolios. Doubt began to creep into their expressions. They wanted an excuse to disregard my evidence. Marcus, however, was not looking at the crowd. He was staring directly at his wife, his chest heaving. He had spent years cleaning up her careless mistakes, quietly covering her tracks when a marketing campaign went over budget or a vendor was left unpaid. He had justified his complicity, believing he was protecting their shared empire. Now he realized he was never a partner in that empire. He was the designated scapegoat. "You knew the combination to the biometric safe?" Marcus said, his voice dropping into a lethal calm. "You asked for it last month, claiming you needed to secure your jewelry while the house staff was cleaning." "Marcus, please," Harper sobbed, reaching out to touch his chest. "You are letting her manipulate you. She forged the IP logs. Anyone with a basic understanding of computers can spoof an IP address. You know that." She clung to his lapels, burying her face against his tuxedo. "Look at me," she pleaded. "I am your wife. We are a team. My father would never let anything happen to us. We protect each other." Marcus looked down at her. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked rapidly near his temple. He slowly reached up and peeled her fingers off his jacket. He took a deliberate step backward, leaving her standing alone in the center of the room. "You did not protect me, Harper," he said, the betrayal carving deep lines into his face. "You framed me. You and your father set me up to take the fall for your stolen millions. If the feds kicked the door down tomorrow morning, I would be the one facing 20 years in federal prison while you played the grieving wife." He turned his back on her, leaving Harper sobbing loudly near the dessert table. The illusion of the golden couple was dead, executed in front of the very people they had sought to impress. But Harper was not finished fighting. Sensing she had lost her husband, she doubled down on her performance for the crowd. She wiped her eyes, smudging her makeup, and pointed an accusing finger at me. "This is a lie," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "She is a fraud. There is no federal investigation. There is no court order. She printed those papers at a copy shop to extort money from our father. Show us the proof, Chloe. Show us the real evidence, or get out of our house before I call the police myself." The investors began to murmur in agreement. A wealthy hedge fund manager near the front stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles. He looked at me with a critical, scrutinizing gaze. "Miss Sterling," the man said, his tone authoritative, "these are extraordinary allegations. You claim our pensions and investments have been diverted to offshore accounts. A single manila folder and a piece of paper with a red stamp are highly concerning, but frankly insufficient to incite panic of this magnitude. If what you say is true, where is the undeniable proof?" The crowd murmured their assent, demanding hard evidence. Harper smirked through her tears, a triumphant glint returning to her eyes. She believed she had successfully cast enough doubt to survive the night. She thought I was bluffing, relying solely on the shock value of the court order. She thought she had won. I looked at the hedge fund manager, then at Harper, and finally at the massive LED screen positioned behind the main stage. The screen was currently displaying a looping montage of my mother, 50 years of high society memories, set to a soft jazz track. "You want undeniable proof?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "I can accommodate that." I did not give Harper the satisfaction of a verbal debate. Arguing with a narcissist in front of an audience only validates their performance. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small black remote. I held it up not toward my sister, but toward the back of the ballroom. Near the massive sound-mixing console overlooking the dance floor, a technician sat in a black polo shirt. For the past 3 hours, he had been flawlessly adjusting the audio levels for the string quartet and cueing the lighting changes for my mother grand entrance. My father had hired the city-top audiovisual production company for this gala. What he did not know was that the FBI Cyber Division had quietly replaced the lead technician during the afternoon setup. I pressed a single button on the remote and gave the technician a brief nod. The soft jazz music playing through the surround sound speakers abruptly cut off. A sharp, jarring squeal of audio feedback pierced the room, causing several guests to cover their ears. The massive LED screen behind the main stage flickered. The carefully curated montage of my mother yacht trips and charity ribbon cuttings vanished into static. Harper's triumphant smirk froze. She spun around to look at the screen. For 2 agonizing seconds, the display remained a solid, blinding white. Then lines of data began to populate the screen. It was not a static spreadsheet. It was a live feed mirroring a secure federal terminal. The text was stark black against the bright background, magnified so large that even the guests standing near the coat check could read every agonizing detail. The screen displayed the internal banking dashboard for 3 offshore accounts registered in the Cayman Islands. The header on the screen clearly identified the primary account holder, Harper Sterling Jefferson. But it was not just a name. Below the account holder information, a live transaction ledger began scrolling. It detailed every incoming wire transfer from the past 14 months. The hedge fund manager who had demanded proof earlier adjusted his spectacles and took a tentative step toward the stage. He squinted at the massive glowing letters. "Wait," the man muttered, his voice trembling. "That routing number. That is the primary escrow account for the Sterling Regional Retirement Fund." I kept my eyes on the crowd as the realization hit them. "You asked for undeniable proof," I said, projecting my voice clearly into the dead silence of the room. "You are currently looking at a live mirrored view of the offshore accounts my sister set up under a series of shell companies." I pressed the remote again. The screen split down the middle. On the left side, the incoming transfers from the Sterling corporate accounts continued to scroll. On the right side, an outgoing ledger appeared detailing exactly where those stolen funds were being spent. The contrast was brutal. On the left, the life savings, pensions, and investment capital of the 300 people in the room. On the right, a grotesque catalog of my sister, staggering vanity. $700,000 wired to a boutique real estate firm in Paris for a luxury flat. $1.2 million transferred to a private aviation company for a fractional jet lease. $200,000 dropped at a high-end auction house in Geneva for a diamond necklace. The dates on the offshore purchases aligned perfectly with the dates the money was drained from the corporate pension fund. A woman in an emerald green dress standing near the front row let out a strangled gasp. She dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the marble floor, sending shards of glass and expensive alcohol everywhere. "That is my money!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. "My father entrusted his entire life savings to your firm, Richard. You told us it was secured in municipal bonds." The initial shock evaporated, replaced by a sudden explosive fury. The polite veneer of high society dissolved instantly. These were not just wealthy individuals. They were ruthless business owners, cutthroat investors, and political figures who prided themselves on being the smartest people in the room. Realizing they had been conned, systematically bled dry by a family they considered peers, was a humiliation they could not stomach. The low murmur of the ballroom erupted into a deafening roar. A retired manufacturing CEO near the bar slammed his fist down, cracking the glass top. He lunged toward my father, grabbing him by the lapels of his custom tuxedo. "You son of a bitch," the man roared, spraying spit in my father's face. "You assured me last week the quarterly dip was a market correction. You were using my retirement to buy your daughter a private jet." Donovan, the head of security, moved instinctively to intervene but stopped. He remembered the court order. He remembered he no longer worked for the man being assaulted. He stepped back, crossing his arms, allowing the enraged CEO to shake my father violently. My father scrambled backward, breaking the man grip. He raised his hands, palms out, retreating toward the stage. "It is a hack," he shouted desperately, trying to be heard over the rising mob. "The screen has been hacked. She fabricated this data. It is a cyber attack." But the investors were no longer listening. The screen continued to scroll, relentless and unforgiving. A new column appeared, matching the stolen funds not just to Harper personal purchases, but to the operational debts of Sterling Investments itself. The data revealed a horrifying truth that went far beyond my sister greed. The company had not turned a legitimate profit in 4 years. Every new investment, every fresh injection of capital from the guests in this room had been immediately diverted to pay off older investors and cover the massive operational hemorrhaging. "It is a Ponzi scheme," the hedge fund manager yelled, his face turning a mottled red. He turned to the crowd, waving his arms frantically. "Richard has been running a Ponzi scheme. The firm is completely insolvent. The money is gone." The word Ponzi ripped through the ballroom like a spark in a powder keg. Panic mutated into absolute chaos. Guests abandoned their composure entirely. Several wealthy patrons shoved past each other, rushing toward the exits to call their legal teams. Others moved aggressively toward the stage surrounding my father and Harper. A prominent local politician grabbed Harper by the arm, demanding his campaign funds be returned immediately. She shrieked, trying to pull away her sapphire gown, tearing at the shoulder seam. The string quartet musicians abandoned their instruments and fled through the service doors. Waiters dropped their trays, scattering hors d'oeuvres across the floor to avoid the surging crowd. The elegant birthday gala had devolved into a financial riot. The elite members of society were reduced to a screaming, frantic mob, tearing at the architects of their ruin. I stood near the edge of the chaos, watching the empire my father had built on lies collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. He was backed against the ice sculpture, fending off angry investors while wildly searching the room for a way out. His pristine reputation, his carefully curated legacy, was disintegrating in real time, broadcasted on a 50-foot screen for all his peers to witness. Through the frantic shouting and the sound of breaking glass, I felt a sharp, painful grip on my bicep. Fingernails dug into my skin with desperate strength. I was jerked backward away from the center of the mob and pulled forcefully into the dimly lit alcove near the kitchen service hallway. The heavy velvet curtains concealed us from the riot, tearing apart the main ballroom. I looked down at the hand gripping my arm. The fingers were adorned with diamond rings that caught the faint light. I followed the arm up and met the terrified, calculating eyes of my mother. Vivian Sterling. She had managed to slip away from the VIP table before the mob descended, and she had dragged me into the shadows to negotiate her survival. The grip on my arm was frantic. Vivian Sterling dragged me behind the heavy velvet drapes separating the main ballroom from the catering corridor. The thick fabric muffled the deafening roar of the financial riot taking place just feet away. Through a narrow gap in the curtains, I could see my father cornered near the shattered remains of the ice sculpture. He was desperately shouting over the enraged crowd, insisting the data breach was a temporary glitch. He was drowning, and his wife had promptly abandoned ship to secure her own survival. Vivian released my bicep. She smoothed the front of her ruined silk gown, taking rapid, shallow breaths to compose herself. When she looked up at me, the calculating panic in her eyes vanished. In its place, she conjured a sudden, terrifying softness. This was her ultimate weapon. When intimidation failed, she deployed maternal affection like a tactical strike. "Chloe, sweetheart." She began, her voice trembling with practiced vulnerability. "You have made your point. You are hurt. You have every right to feel this way." I stood silently observing the performance. For my entire childhood, I had craved this exact tone. I had starved for a single ounce of genuine warmth from the woman who viewed her children merely as accessories. Now, hearing it felt like chewing on glass. She reached out and cupped my cheek. Her palm was ice cold against my skin. "We made a terrible mistake 8 years ago," she whispered, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Your father was under immense pressure to save the firm. We panicked. But we can fix this. I can fix this right now." She leaned closer, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial hush. "Stop the investigation, Chloe. Call your supervisors and withdraw the receiver order. Tell them the initial audit was flawed. If you do this, I will personally ensure your original trust fund is fully restored with interest. I will force Richard to step down and name you a managing partner. You will be reinstated in the family will. You will have your life back. You will be a Sterling again." She offered the restoration of my name as if handing me the keys to a kingdom. She genuinely believed her approval was a currency I still valued. She thought I was the same terrified 24-year-old girl willing to shoulder the blame just to stay in the family portrait. I let the silence stretch. I did not pull away from her cold hand. I simply stared at her until the fake maternal warmth began to fracture under my unblinking gaze. Then I laughed. It was a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the narrow walls of the service corridor. Vivian recoiled as if I had struck her. Her hand dropped from my face. "You think you can buy my silence with money that no longer exists?" I asked, my voice dropping to a lethal calm. "The trust fund you are offering me evaporated 3 years ago. Your husband drained it to cover margin calls on bad commercial real estate bets. You have nothing left to offer, Vivian." "I am offering you your family back," she hissed, the motherly facade slipping to reveal the venom underneath. "I am offering you a chance to avoid destroying your own blood. You are offering me a seat on a sinking ship," I replied. "And you are doing it because you know exactly what the forensic audit found in your personal ledgers." Vivian stiffened. The color drained from her cheeks. We were not alone in the dim alcove. Several high society wives had retreated into this exact corridor to escape the shoving and flying glass out on the main floor. They stood clustered near the double doors of the kitchen, clutching their designer evening bags. Among them were Beatrice DuPont and Sylvia Carmichael, the two most influential socialites in Greenwich. They were also the primary board members of the charity my mother chaired. They stood perfectly still, listening to every word of our exchange. I turned my attention away from my mother and looked directly at Beatrice. Vivian tried to intercept my gaze. "Chloe, do not do this," she pleaded, her voice cracking with genuine terror now. "The Bright Futures Children's Foundation," I announced, making sure my voice carried clearly to the listening women, founded and chaired by Vivian Sterling to provide educational resources for underprivileged youth in the tri-state area, a noble cause. Beatrice and Sylvia exchanged a confused, uneasy glance. "Last month, Beatrice," I said, keeping my eyes locked on the wealthy board member, "you wrote a personal check for $50,000 at the spring luncheon. You were told those funds would be used to build a new pediatric wing at the community hospital." Beatrice took a hesitant step forward. "Yes," she said, her voice tight with suspicion. "I wrote that check. Vivian assured me the construction contract was already signed." "There is no construction contract," I stated coldly. The federal audit traced that exact deposit. The funds sat in the charity escrow account for exactly 48 hours before being transferred to a vendor listed as Prime Event Solutions, a vendor registered as a limited liability company in Delaware. I turned back to my mother, who was visibly trembling. Her meticulously styled hair seemed to lose its luster. Prime Event Solutions is a shell entity registered to Vivian Sterling. I revealed the truth, striking the air like a whip. There are no educational resources. There is no pediatric wing. For the past 6 years, the Bright Futures Children's Foundation has operated as a sophisticated money laundering vehicle. My mother diverted millions in charitable donations to fund her jewelry collections, her luxury spa retreats in the Swiss Alps, and the ongoing maintenance of her private yacht. Sylvia Carmichael gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Beatrice DuPont face flushed with absolute outrage. Vivian spun around to face her peers, raising her hands defensively. "Beatrice, please," she stammered, her voice frantic. "She is lying. She is a disgruntled child trying to ruin me. The charity accounts are audited annually, audited by a firm your husband owns," I corrected sharply. "The Department of Justice seized the real ledgers yesterday morning. The diamond earrings you are wearing right now, Vivian, the ones you claimed were an anniversary gift from Richard. They were purchased in Milan 3 days after the annual charity gala, using funds earmarked for a youth literacy program." The silence in the corridor was heavier than the riot in the ballroom. For the Greenwich elite, financial fraud was a scandal, but stealing from a highly publicized children's charity was social suicide. It was the one sin their circle would never forgive. Beatrice stared at the diamond earrings glittering on my mother lobes. The disgust radiating from the older woman was palpable. "You are disgusting, Vivian," Beatrice said, her voice trembling with quiet fury. "You paraded those underprivileged children across the stage at the gala while you were stealing the money right out of their hands. Do not ever speak to me again." Sylvia turned her back entirely, refusing to even look at the woman she had called a friend for 2 decades. "Wait," Vivian pleaded, taking a desperate step toward them. "Beatrice, Sylvia, you have to let me explain." They ignored her, pushing through the kitchen doors and disappearing into the night. They were eager to put as much distance between themselves and the toxic fallout as possible. The social empire my mother had spent her entire adult life cultivating evaporated in a matter of seconds. Her status, her influence, her carefully curated image were gone forever. The realization crashed down on her with crushing physical force. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the cold tile floor of the service corridor. The silk of her expensive gown pooled around her in a pathetic heap. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, not out of guilt for the children she defrauded, but mourning the permanent loss of her elite status. She was now a pariah. I looked down at her, feeling nothing but a profound, hollow clarity. There was no joy in this victory, just the necessary extraction of a rotten tooth. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit, preparing to step back into the ballroom to finish the job. But before I could reach for the velvet curtain, my phone vibrated sharply in my breast pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the encrypted screen. It was a message from the lead FBI agent staging outside the estate perimeter. "Target timeline accelerated. We breached the main gates in exactly 15 minutes. I locked the screen. 15 minutes. The clock was ticking down to the final 0. If the feds breached the doors before I secured the remaining digital keys, the offshore ghost accounts would permanently lock down, triggering an automatic wipe. I needed the master decryption phrase, and only one man in the building possessed it. I pushed through the drapes and stepped back into the war zone. I had exactly 900 seconds to corner my father and force him to surrender the keys to his kingdom before the sirens drowned us all out. I left my mother weeping on the floor of the service corridor and pushed through the heavy velvet drapes. The main ballroom was a disaster zone. High society had descended into a feral panic. Expensive floral arrangements were trampled underfoot. The grand buffet tables were overturned, sending sterling silver platters crashing to the marble. Investors who had been sipping vintage champagne an hour ago were now frantically shouting into their cell phones, screaming at their brokers to liquidate whatever sterling assets remained. I scanned the chaos. Through the surging crowd, I spotted my father. Richard Sterling had retreated to the raised dais near the shattered ice sculpture. He was flanked by 2 remaining security guards who looked deeply uncertain about whose orders they should follow. The head of security, Donovan, had already vanished, recognizing a lost cause when he saw one. My father was pacing. The bespoke tuxedo that usually gave him the aura of an untouchable titan now looked disheveled. His bow tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck. His face was slick with sweat. He was barking orders into his mobile phone, but from the frantic way he kept hanging up and redialing, I knew no one was answering. His legal team had abandoned him. I checked my watch. 8:45 p.m. The encrypted message from the lead FBI agent burned in my mind. 15 minutes, 900 seconds until a tactical team breached the main gates of this estate, and simultaneous teams raided the Sterling corporate headquarters downtown. I needed the master decryption phrase for the offshore ghost accounts before the federal raid triggered the automated data wipe protocol. I navigated through the panicking guests' side, stepping a shattered crystal vase. I approached the dais. My father saw me coming. The anger that had fueled his earlier outburst was gone. The harsh reality of his situation had finally breached his formidable ego. He waved off the 2 hesitant security guards stepping forward to meet me at the edge of the stage. "Chloe," he began, his voice lacking its usual thunderous command. He looked over my shoulder, nervously eyeing the exit doors where several VIPs were already fleeing. "We need to talk, privately." "There is no more private, Richard," I said, my voice flat and unyielding. "The public spectacle you orchestrated tonight is officially over." I stepped onto the dais, closing the distance between us. I did not raise my voice, but the quiet intensity of my tone forced him to listen. At exactly 9:00 p.m., I announced, checking my watch again, making sure he saw the gesture. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation will execute a no-knock warrant at the Sterling corporate headquarters on 5th Avenue. A secondary tactical team is currently staging at the perimeter of this estate. You have exactly 14 minutes before federal agents walk through those double doors and place you in handcuffs." His eyes widened in raw, unfiltered terror. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking fragile and old. The titan of industry was reduced to a desperate, cornered man. "You cannot let them do this," he stammered, taking a step toward me. His hands trembled as he reached out, gesturing frantically. "Chloe, if the FBI seizes those servers, the automated protocols will wipe the primary ledgers. Everything will be gone. The company will be obliterated." "I know," I replied smoothly. "That is why I am giving you a choice. Hand over the master decryption phrase for the Cayman ghost accounts. Provide the access codes right now, and I will ensure the federal prosecutors note your cooperation during the sentencing phase." He stared at me, processing the ultimatum. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence shattered. He realized he was no longer negotiating from a position of power. He was bargaining for years off his life. He swallowed hard, looking around the ruined ballroom. His empire was burning, and I was holding the only fire extinguisher. He made a sudden, desperate calculation. He shifted his posture, attempting to summon the charismatic charm that had built his fortune. "Chloe, listen to me," he pleaded, dropping his voice to a frantic whisper. He reached out and grabbed my shoulders. I did not flinch away, but I did not lean into his grasp either. "You are a smart girl," he said, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. "You always were the smartest one in this family. Brighter than Harper, sharper than Marcus. I see that now. I was wrong to push you away. I was wrong to protect your sister." He squeezed my shoulders, leaning in closer. The smell of expensive scotch was overwhelming. "Do not let them destroy everything I built," he urged, his voice cracking with desperation. "We can fix this, you and me. Call your supervisors. Tell them you secured the ledgers. Tell them to call off the raid. Delay them for 24 hours. Just give me 1 day to restructure the assets." I stood perfectly still, letting his frantic plea wash over me. "If you make that call," he continued, his tone shifting from a plea to an aggressive bribe, "I will step down tonight, effective immediately. I will sign the company over to you. You will be the CEO of Sterling Investments. I will transfer total control of the remaining legal assets into a trust solely in your name. You will have everything: Power, wealth, respect. You will control the entire board. Just give me 24 hours. He released my shoulders and stepped back, panting slightly, waiting for my response. It was the ultimate bribe, the keys to the kingdom. He was offering me the very thing he had denied me for my entire life: validation power and undisputed control over the family legacy. He was betting that the wounded 24-year-old girl he had exiled 8 years ago still lived inside me, desperate for her father approval and hungry for revenge against the golden child. He assumed I would compromise my federal badge for a corner office and a billion-dollar title. He waited, holding his breath, expecting me to pull out my phone and halt the raid. I looked at him, studying the desperate sweat on his brow and the frantic hope in his eyes. The clock ticked down. 12 minutes left. I let a slow, chilling smile touch my lips. "It is a generous offer, Richard," I said, my voice echoing softly in the space between us. CEO of Sterling Investments, total control of the legal assets, a remarkable promotion for a disgraced daughter. He nodded eagerly, misinterpreting my calm demeanor as acceptance. "Yes, exactly," he urged. "Just make the call, Chloe. We can save the firm." I reached into my inner jacket pocket. I did not pull out my phone to halt the raid. Instead, I withdrew a folded sheet of paper. It was a certified bank statement printed on heavy stock. I unfolded it deliberately and held it up so the harsh light of the remaining chandeliers illuminated the text. "There is just one minor problem with your negotiation strategy," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "You cannot bribe me with legal assets because there are no legal assets left." His eager expression froze. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "The domestic real estate portfolio, the commercial leases, they are solid. They are legitimate." "They were legitimate," I corrected. 3 years ago, I thrust the bank statement toward him, forcing him to look at the undeniable proof of his own ruin. "Look at the document, Richard. Look at the balance on the primary domestic holding accounts, the accounts that hold the titles to your commercial properties." He squinted at the page. His eyes scanned the columns, stopping abruptly at the bottom line. The balance was not a string of impressive zeros. It was a negative figure highlighted in red ink. "You drained the legal assets," I stated coldly. "When the Ponzi scheme started collapsing, when the new investor capital could not cover the payouts, you panicked. You quietly leveraged every single piece of legitimate domestic real estate you owned. You took out massive high-interest loans using those properties as collateral to keep the offshore accounts liquid." He stared at the negative balance, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He knew what he had done, but seeing the federal confirmation of his actions broke the last remnants of his sanity. "The company you are offering me is a hollow shell." I continued, my tone devoid of any pity. "Sterling Investments holds over $400 million in toxic debt. The banks hold the liens on all your commercial properties. The moment the FBI raid becomes public knowledge tomorrow morning, the creditors will call in those loans. The firm will be forced into immediate Chapter 11 bankruptcy." I stepped closer, bringing my face inches from his. The smell of his fear was palpable. "You are offering me the captain chair on the Titanic after it has already split in half," I whispered. "I do not want your company, Richard. I want the decryption phrase." The clock ticked down. 9 minutes. My father backed away from me, stumbling slightly. He bumped into the edge of the dais, knocking a silver tray to the floor. The loud clatter startled the few remaining guests who were frantically pushing toward the exit doors. He realized his ultimate bribe had failed. He realized I had seen through the illusion of his wealth. The mask of the powerful CEO was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, unpredictable energy of a cornered predator. He looked around the ruined ballroom, then back at me. His eyes darted wildly. If he could not bribe his way out, he would have to find another way to survive. The desperation in his gaze shifted into something much more dangerous. He was no longer trying to negotiate. He was calculating his escape, and he was calculating who he had to sacrifice to ensure he made it out of the building. The two undercover agents dressed in crisp catering uniforms held their positions flanking Senator Thomas Harrison. The politician did not cower. Men who have spent decades wrapping themselves in the American flag and state legislation rarely recognize when their armor has fractured. Harrison straightened his silk tie. He squared his shoulders, thrusting his chest forward to project the practiced authority that had won him 3 consecutive elections. He glared at the agents, then turned his lethal focus onto me. "You are making a catastrophic error, Miss Sterling." His voice was a booming baritone trained in marble chambers and crowded campaign rallies. "You are detaining a sitting state official based on fabricated financial records. This is not an investigation. This is treasonous slander." I held his gaze. "Senator, your environmental protection initiatives are well documented in the press. You leveraged your committee chair position to stall the Sterling commercial zoning permits. You manufactured ecological compliance violations on our development sites. Then you offered my father a quiet resolution, $5 million channeled into a consulting firm registered to your sister-in-law." Harrison let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. It was the harsh sound of a man who believed his elite status granted him permanent invulnerability. "You are a low-level federal auditor with a bitter vendetta against her own father," he sneered. "You walk in here waving a digital tablet and making baseless accusations. I sit on the Judicial Oversight Committee. I know the Attorney General personally. By tomorrow morning, you will be stripped of your badge. By tomorrow afternoon, you will be indicted for federal extortion and defamation." The few remaining guests lingered near the exit doors, captivated by the unfolding power struggle. Harrison raised a manicured finger, pointing it directly at my face. "Tell your handlers to back down right now," he commanded. "If you apologize and retract these lies, I might let you keep your freedom. If you persist, I will ensure you never work in finance or government again. You will be ruined." The threat hung heavy in the opulent air. He wielded state power like a bludgeon, attempting to crush my resolve under the immense weight of his political connections. He expected me to falter. He expected the mention of the Attorney General to send a chill down my spine and force a retreat. I did not blink. I looked down at the sleek digital tablet resting in my left hand. "You rely heavily on the perception of secure networks. Senator," I said, my tone conversational and devoid of intimidation, "you assumed the encrypted email platform you used to communicate your demands to my father was impenetrable. You thought routing the extortion payments through a decentralized cryptocurrency exchange would mask the digital trail." His patronizing smile began to waver slightly at the edges. "But extortion leaves an indelible footprint," I continued. "When my father authorized those hush money payments, he used a distinct corporate routing sequence. My team mirrored his outgoing transfers and traced them directly into your offshore shell accounts. We also recovered the deleted correspondence from your private server." Harrison swallowed hard. The healthy flush began to drain from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly white. "Nonsense," he muttered, his booming voice losing its resonance. "You have nothing." I tapped the screen of the tablet, waking it from sleep mode. The bright glow illuminated the sharp angles of my face. "I have 74 individual emails." "Senator," I corrected softly. "Emails where you explicitly threatened to bury the Sterling zoning permits unless your consulting fees were doubled. I also have the banking ledgers matching those exact dates and exact dollar amounts." He took a frantic step forward, panic finally breaching his composure. "Give me that device." The undercover agent stepped closer, placing their hands on their holstered weapons. Harrison froze, instantly recognizing the physical boundary he could not cross. I rested my index finger over the glowing blue transmission icon on the touchscreen. "You threatened to destroy my career using your political influence," I said, locking eyes with him. "Let us see how much influence you retain when the voting public sees your consulting fees." I pressed the button. A soft chime echoed from the tablet, confirming the action. "I did not just send those encrypted emails to the Department of Justice Public Integrity section," I announced, watching his expression shatter into profound despair. "I sent the files to the investigative desks at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and every major regional news outlet. Your extortion demands are currently sitting in the inboxes of 50 different federal prosecutors and financial journalists. The effect was instantaneous. Across the ruined ballroom, the mobile phones of the remaining elite guests began to chime and vibrate in unison. News alerts were triggering. The scandal was already breaking across the digital landscape. Senator Harrison opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. His political shield, the impenetrable fortress he had built around his career, evaporated in a single keystroke. He was no longer a powerful lawmaker, capable of bending the justice system to his will. He was a disgraced criminal facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The agent to his right moved swiftly. He grabbed the senator by the wrist, spinning him around and forcing his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly in the quiet space, bridging the gap between high society and the criminal justice system. Thomas Harrison, you are under arrest for federal extortion and wire fraud. The agent recited, his voice devoid of emotion. Harrison struggled weakly, his shoulders sagging as they marched him toward the service elevator. His departure marked the destruction of my father's last remaining umbrella of protection. Richard watched the senator being dragged away in disbelief. The reality of his total isolation crashed over him. His bribes had failed. His political leverage was handcuffed. The federal tactical teams were minutes away from breaching his corporate headquarters. He had exhausted every traditional method of survival. His panic mutated into raw, unhinged madness. He spun around his eyes, darting frantically across the room until they locked onto Marcus Jefferson. Marcus was standing near the edge of the stage, clutching his mobile phone. He was watching the collapse of the Sterling Empire with a pale, stunned expression, unable to tear his eyes away from the handcuffed politician. "Marcus!" My father screamed, his voice tearing through the room like a siren. Marcus jolted, turning to face his father-in-law. "Initiate the burn protocol!" Richard roared, sprinting toward the younger executive. "Do it right now!" Marcus stared at him, his thumb hovering over the dark screen of his phone. Richard grabbed him by the lapels of his tuxedo, shaking him with terrifying force. "The feds are breaching the Fifth Avenue servers in less than 10 minutes, Richard yelled, spit flying from his lips. "If they seize those drives, we are all dead. They will find the ghost ledgers. They will find the offshore shell registrations. They will find everything." The burn protocol was the ultimate failsafe. I knew of its existence from the forensic audit fragments my team had decoded weeks ago. It was a localized command embedded in the executive mobile devices. A single swipe would trigger a cascading deletion across the entire Sterling cloud infrastructure. It would flood the corporate servers with corrupted data, overwrite the hard drives, and initiate a thermal overload to physically melt the storage arrays. It was designed to erase every trace of financial history before law enforcement could unplug the machines. "Pull up the application," Richard commanded, his eyes wild with terror. "Enter your executive override. Wipe the cloud, erase the backups, burn it all to the ground." Marcus looked down at his device. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He held the power to destroy the evidence, but executing the command would also make him an active participant in the destruction of federal evidence. It would upgrade his current charges from financial negligence to deliberate obstruction of justice. It was the difference between a plea deal and spending the rest of his natural life behind bars. "Do not just stand there," Richard shrieked, shoving Marcus backward against the stage. "Execute the command. Save the company." I watched the exchange, maintaining my distance. The trap was set. Marcus Jefferson stood at the crossroads of his entire life, holding the phone that could either ignite the fire or extinguish it forever. The ticking clock had reached its final seconds. The weight of the Sterling Empire rested entirely on his thumb. Marcus Jefferson stood perfectly still. The violent shaking from his father-in-law did not register. His eyes remained locked on the black screen of his mobile device. The weight of his impending decision seemed to draw all the air from the ruined ballroom. For the last 6 years, Marcus had been the perfect corporate soldier. He arrived early, stayed late, and smoothed over every rough edge the Sterling family created. He was the barrier that protected them from the consequences of their own arrogance. He accepted their thinly veiled condescension because he believed the sacrifice would secure his legacy. He thought he was building an empire. Looking at the phone, he realized he had only been digging his own grave. "Execute the command." Richard screamed again, his voice cracking with hysteria. His fists bunched the lapels of Marcus' bespoke tuxedo. "Wipe the drives right now." Marcus slowly looked up from the screen. He met Richard's frantic gaze with an expression of profound, chilling clarity. The deferential son-in-law, the compliant executive, vanished. The man standing on the dais was suddenly recognizing his own intrinsic worth for the very first time. "No," Marcus said. The single syllable was quiet, but it carried a finality that struck the older man like a physical blow. Richard released his grip, stepping backward in sheer disbelief. "What did you say?" "I said no." Marcus repeated, his voice gaining volume and resonance. "I am not burning the servers, Richard. I am not triggering the automated wipe." "You insolent fool!" Richard roared, lunging forward again. "If they secure those drives, we are going to federal prison for the rest of our natural lives." "No," Richard Marcus corrected softly, shaking his head. "You are going to federal prison. Harper is going to federal prison." Marcus reached up and deliberately smoothed the crumpled lapels of his jacket. He took a deep breath, squaring his broad shoulders. He looked across the expanse of the marble floor directly at his wife. Harper was cowering near the dessert table, her tear-streaked face pale with fresh horror. "For years I cleaned up the messes you two created," Marcus said, projecting his voice so everyone remaining in the room could hear. "I thought I was protecting a partnership, a family. But earlier tonight I realized the truth. When the audits finally caught up with you, when the missing $50 million triggered a federal inquiry, you did not plan to fight it together." He pointed an accusatory finger at his wife. "You used my digital authorization tokens, Harper. You logged into the corporate mainframe using my biometric bypass. You framed me to take the fall for your offshore embezzlement. You set me up to be the designated scapegoat so you could continue playing the innocent heiress." Harper flinched, shaking her head frantically. "Marcus, please," she whimpered, taking a hesitant step forward. "Do not do this. We can fix it. You cannot fix betrayal." Marcus snapped his composure, finally breaking to reveal the raw agony underneath. "You sacrificed my life to save your own." He turned his attention back to Richard. The older man was vibrating with helpless fury, realizing his command structure had collapsed entirely. "I am not going down for your crimes," Marcus declared. "I refuse to spend the next 30 years in a federal penitentiary while you hire expensive lawyers to blame the minority executive who married into the family." Marcus slid his hand into the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo. He did not pull out his phone to execute the burn protocol. Instead, he withdrew a small metallic object. It was a heavy encrypted flash drive, a specialized device used exclusively by high-level financial officers to securely transport sensitive data offline. He held it up, the polished metal glinting harshly under the chandelier lights. "You always underestimated me, Richard," Marcus said, a grim smile touching his lips. "You assumed I was just a polished operational manager blindly following orders. But you forget that I built the digital infrastructure for this company. I designed the redundant backup systems." Richard stared at the drive, his breath catching in his throat. "What is that?" "This is my life insurance policy," Marcus replied, his tone turning lethal. "It is a mirrored copy of the unedited master ledger. It contains every unencrypted transaction, every offshore shell company routing number, and every internal email directing the movement of stolen pension funds over the last 4 years." He stepped off the dais and walked deliberately toward me. The remaining guests parted, clearing a path for his approach. He stopped 2 feet away, holding the drive out. "I am handing this over to the Department of Justice," Marcus stated, looking directly into my eyes. "I am formally requesting a meeting with the federal prosecutor. I am prepared to offer full unrestricted cooperation in exchange for criminal immunity." I looked at the drive, then met his determined gaze. The man standing before me had shed his illusions. He was making a tactical, ruthless decision to survive. "I will ensure the prosecutor receives it tonight," I said, reaching out and taking the heavy metal device from his hand. "Your cooperation will be noted on the official record. "You traitor!" a voice shrieked, shattering the tense negotiation. Harper launched herself from the dessert table. The pristine image of the society princess evaporated entirely. She charged across the ballroom like a feral animal, her sapphire gown tearing as she sprinted. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She slammed into Marcus with terrifying momentum. Her hands flew up her manicured nails, raking viciously across his face. She aimed for his eyes, screaming a litany of obscenities that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "You ruined everything!" She shrieked, her voice hoarse and ragged. "You spineless coward! You were supposed to protect us!" Marcus stumbled backward, raising his arms to shield his face from her frantic assault. He did not strike back, but he grabbed her wrist, trying to restrain her flailing limbs. Harper thrashed wildly, kicking at his shins and spitting venomous insults. "Let go of me!" she screamed, twisting her body violently. "I will kill you! I will destroy you!" The chaos escalated instantly. The polite, refined atmosphere of the Greenwich Gala was completely obliterated. It was no longer a high society gathering. It was a brutal, physical brawl. Vivian, having recovered somewhat from her earlier collapse in the service corridor, emerged from the shadows. Seeing her daughter engaged in a violent physical altercation, she let out a horrified shriek. "Harper, stop it!" Vivian cried out, rushing forward to intervene. She grabbed her daughter by the shoulders, attempting to pull her away from the struggling executive. Harper let him go. "The police are coming." But Harper was beyond reason. The impending reality of federal prison, the loss of her wealth, her status, her entire identity had fractured her sanity. She yanked her shoulders violently to escape her mother's grasp. The sudden aggressive movement threw Vivian off balance. The older woman stumbled backward, her high heels slipping on the slick marble floor that was now covered in spilled champagne and shattered glass. She let out a sharp cry as she fell crashing hard onto the debris-strewn ground. Mother Harper shrieked, turning her head momentarily distracted by the fall. Marcus seized the opportunity. He released her wrists and shoved her firmly away, creating physical distance. He backed toward the exit doors, his face bleeding from several deep scratches along his cheek and jawline. "I am done!" he shouted, breathing heavily. "I am done covering for this family. You are on your own." He turned and bolted through the shattered main entrance, disappearing into the night, leaving the wreckage of his marriage behind. Harper stood panting in the center of the ruined ballroom. She looked at her mother sprawled on the floor amidst the broken crystal and crushed floral arrangements. She looked at her father, standing frozen on the stage, watching his empire collapse in a violent, humiliating spectacle. The Sterling family, the undisputed royalty of local high society, was tearing itself apart like a pack of starving wolves. Their meticulously crafted facade of elegance and superiority was gone, replaced by the raw, ugly reality of their greed. Through the chaos, a new sound began to permeate the heavy air, faint at first, then growing rapidly louder. It was the sharp, piercing wail of police sirens approaching the estate from the main highway. My father snapped his head toward the entrance. The sound of the approaching sirens galvanized him. The brawl, the betrayal, the loss of the digital ledger. None of it mattered anymore. He had one final desperate move left to play before the steel trap closed around him completely. The piercing wail of police sirens cut through the heavy air of the ballroom. The sound grew louder with every passing second, signaling the rapid approach of law enforcement. Harper was on her knees beside Vivian, weeping hysterically into her mother-ruined silk gown. The few remaining guests scrambled over overturned chairs and slipped on spilled champagne, desperate to reach the service exits before the tactical units sealed the perimeter. I stood in the center of the devastation, clutching the encrypted flash drive Marcus had surrendered. The air smelled of expensive perfume, spilled alcohol, and sheer panic. My father ignored his sobbing wife and daughter on the floor. Men like Richard Sterling do not offer comfort when their own survival is threatened. They cut their losses. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. His hands trembled slightly as he reached up to adjust his crooked bow tie. He smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo, attempting to resurrect the shattered facade of the untouchable CEO. He looked around the ruined ballroom, taking in the shattered ice sculpture and the abandoned instruments of the string quartet. Then he turned his focus back to me. His panic had receded, replaced by a chilling, arrogant calm. He had processed the loss of the company, the betrayal of his son-in-law, and the impending federal raid. He had calculated the damage and concluded that he still held a trump card. "You think you have won, Chloe," he said, his voice echoing sharply over the ambient noise of the sirens. "You think walking in here with a federal order and a stolen flash drive means you have destroyed me." He stepped off the dais, walking toward me with a slow, deliberate stride. He did not look at the court order in my hand. He looked past me toward the vaulted ceiling and the crystal chandeliers. "The company is gone," he conceded, offering a dismissive shrug. "The commercial properties, the corporate accounts, the offshore shell companies. Take them. The feds can spend the next 5 years unraveling that mess. I will hire the best defense attorneys on the eastern seaboard and tie the Justice Department up in litigation until I die of old age." He stopped a few feet away, folding his arms across his chest. A smug, triumphant smile touched his lips. "But you cannot touch this estate," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. I raised an eyebrow, waiting for the punchline. "This house, the vehicles, the private accounts, the entire personal fortune." He gestured grandly to the opulent surroundings. "None of it is registered to Sterling Investments. None of it is tied to the corporate ledgers. It is completely isolated from the impending bankruptcy and the federal seizure." He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial, triumphant whisper. 15 years ago, I placed our primary residence and all significant personal assets into a fully irrevocable blind trust. It is registered in Delaware under a shell corporation utilizing your mother maiden name. The legal structure is impenetrable. The federal government cannot pierce the corporate veil of a properly executed blind trust established prior to the commission of any alleged crimes. He laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Let the FBI seize the office buildings. Let them freeze the corporate accounts. I will walk out of here tonight, hire my legal team, and spend the remainder of my life living comfortably in this $10 million mansion. You fought a brilliant tactical battle, Chloe, but you lost the war. You cannot leave me destitute." He turned his back on me, preparing to walk toward the grand staircase and retreat to the safety of his impenetrable fortress, while the authorities dealt with the wreckage below. The arrogance was staggering. He genuinely believed his wealth granted him immunity from the consequences of his actions. He thought he had outsmarted the system, built an unbreachable bunker, and secured his lavish lifestyle regardless of the lives he ruined. I watched him take 2 confident steps toward the stairs. Then I let out a low, chilling laugh. The sound stopped him in his tracks. He froze, turning his head slowly to look over his shoulder. The smug smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "A blind trust," I repeated, my tone dripping with icy amusement. "A brilliant legal maneuver, Richard. Truly textbook asset protection. The corporate veil in Delaware is indeed notoriously difficult for federal prosecutors to pierce." I reached into my inner jacket pocket for the final time. I did not pull out another spreadsheet or a digital tablet. I withdrew a single sheet of heavy legal parchment. It was folded neatly in thirds. It is nearly impossible to breach an irrevocable trust. I continued walking slowly toward him. Unless, of course, the primary trustee voluntarily punctures the veil themselves. I unfolded the document. The top margin featured the bold, aggressive logo of Vanguard National Bank. Below it, the text was dense with legal jargon, but the header was printed in large, unmistakable font. "Notice of default and immediate asset foreclosure." My father stared at the document, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What is that? What nonsense are you spouting now?" I handed him the paper. He snatched it from my grip, his eyes scanning the dense text. "The problem with appointing a spouse as the primary trustee of an isolated asset pool," I explained, keeping my voice steady and loud enough to cut through the rising wail of the sirens outside, "is that you grant them unilateral authority to leverage those assets." My father's eyes darted back and forth across the page, reading the details of the foreclosure notice. His breathing hitched. The color drained from his face for the second time that night. "Your wife has a problem, Richard," I said, nodding toward Vivian, who was still sobbing on the floor, clutching Harper's hand. You managed the corporate fraud, but you completely ignored the domestic hemorrhaging. Vivian's head snapped up at the mention of her name. Her tear-streaked face twisted in sudden, panicked recognition. She scrambled to her feet, pushing Harper away. "Richard, do not listen to her!" Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "It is a lie. She is trying to trick you." My father did not look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the foreclosure notice, his hands trembling violently. Vivian has spent the last 4 years quietly frequenting high-stakes underground gambling syndicates operating out of Macau and Monaco, I revealed, watching the final pillar of his empire crumble. The charity embezzlement was not just for diamond earrings and spa retreats. She was drowning in 8 figures of gambling debt to people who do not negotiate payment plans. I pointed a finger directly at the document in his hands. 6 weeks ago, facing aggressive collection tactics from her creditors, your wife utilized her authority as the primary trustee. She quietly leveraged this entire estate. She took out a $12 million high-yield mortgage against the property to cover her syndicate markers. My father slowly lowered the paper. He turned to face his wife. The look in his eyes was no longer angry. It was hollow-gutted. "Vivian," he whispered, his voice breaking, "tell me you did not leverage the house." Vivian backed away, raising her hands defensively. "I had to." "Richard," she sobbed. "They were threatening me. They said they would expose everything. I thought I could win it back. I thought I could cover the interest payments before you found out. But you could not cover the interest payments," I interjected, stepping between them. "The first balloon payment was due 48 hours ago. The trust defaulted." I looked my father dead in the eye, delivering the final fatal blow. "The blind trust is shattered, Richard. The asset protection is gone. This $10 million mansion no longer belongs to you or your shell corporation. Vanguard National Bank executed the foreclosure clause this morning. As of 8:00 a.m., the title to this estate officially transferred to the lending institution." The silence that followed was profound. The wailing sirens outside were deafening, but inside the ruined ballroom, the realization hit with the force of a physical impact. "You are not retreating to your impenetrable fortress," I stated, my voice carrying absolute finality. "You do not own a mansion. You do not own the cars in the driveway. You do not have a single dime of protected personal wealth left to hire a defense attorney." I took a slow, deliberate step backward, surveying the wreckage of the family that had discarded me. "You are a homeless man standing in a bank-owned property, Richard. And the federal tactical teams currently breaching your front gates are not just here to seize your corporate servers, they are here to evict you." The grand illusion was completely eradicated. The untouchable titan of industry was stripped of everything. His company, his political protection, his loyal son-in-law, his wealth, and finally the very roof over his head. The meticulous legal fortress he relied on had been dismantled not by my hand, but by the reckless greed of the woman he had chosen to protect over his own daughter. Before my father could process the sheer totality of his ruin, a new presence moved through the shadows of the shattered ballroom, preparing to deliver the final official stroke of justice. My father stood amidst the ruins of his empire, his face a mask of shattered comprehension. The foreclosure notice hung limply from his fingers. The cacophony of approaching police sirens seeped through the shattered terrace doors. But inside the ballroom, the silence was suffocating. He looked at the paper, then at Vivian, who was still weeping near the velvet drapes, and finally his gaze snapped back to me. The initial shock mutated quickly back into the familiar toxic arrogance he had wielded like a weapon his entire life. If he was going to lose everything he intended to ensure, he inflicted maximum collateral damage on his way down. He took a menacing step forward, his hands balling into tight fists. "You think you are so clever, Chloe," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "You think tearing down your own blood makes you a hero? You are nothing but a vindictive, ungrateful child. I built this family. I gave you a name. I gave you a life. And you throw it all away because you were too weak to handle the pressure. You will burn for this. I will make sure you burn." He drew a breath to deliver another volley of venomous insults. "Richard, that is enough." The voice was not a shout, but it carried a commanding resonance that instantly silenced the room. It possessed the undeniable weight of absolute authority. Judge Bradley Kensington stepped out from the shadows near the grand staircase. He had remained a quiet observer since his initial intervention, standing silently while the financial and personal carnage unfolded. The guests who had not yet fled the scene parted instinctively as he moved toward the center of the ballroom. Kensington was a veteran of the federal bench, a man known for his unflinching adherence to the law and a profound disdain for white-collar criminals who believed their wealth purchased immunity. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and walked deliberately, stopping just a few feet from my father. "You invited me here tonight," Richard, under the pretense of a social gathering. Kensington began, his tone conversational but laced with steel. "You spent the last 6 months attempting to court my favor, subtly suggesting that my decisions on the zoning board might be mutually beneficial. You believed my presence at your wife Gala would signal to your investors that your operations carried the blessing of the federal judiciary." My father swallowed hard, the bluster draining from him. "Judge," he started, raising a hand in a feeble attempt at diplomacy. "This is a targeted smear campaign. She is manipulating documents." To Kensington held up a single index finger, stopping the frantic defense instantly. "I did not attend your event tonight to enjoy the caviar or admire the floral arrangements," Richard the judge stated, his eyes narrowing. "I attended because the Department of Justice requested my presence to personally oversee the execution of a federal asset freeze. I wanted to witness firsthand the man who systematically defrauded 300 working-class pension funds while sipping vintage champagne in a $10 million mansion." The judge turned his gaze toward me, offering a brief, respectful nod. "Agent Sterling presented the preliminary audit findings to my chambers 48 hours ago." Kensington continued, addressing my father, but ensuring the remaining guests heard every word. The evidence of offshore embezzlement, wire fraud, and corporate malfeasance was not merely compelling. It was overwhelming. It was the most meticulously documented forensic case I have reviewed in my 20 years on the bench. He looked back at my father, the contempt in his eyes clear and unyielding. "You are not a titan of industry, Richard. You are a common thief operating on a larger scale." My father's jaw clenched tight. The reality of his situation crystallized. He was not debating a disgruntled daughter or a rebellious son-in-law. He was facing a federal judge who had already seen the unredacted truth. The sirens outside shifted from a distant wail to a deafening roar as the tactical vehicles breached the main gates and tore up the long, winding driveway. Blue and red lights pulsed fiercely through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting frantic shadows across the marble floor. Kensington reached inside his suit jacket. He did not pull out a weapon or a communication device. He withdrew a thick manila envelope and a sleek silver fountain pen. He walked over to the nearest surface, the ruined mahogany bar still sticky with spilled champagne and scattered ice. He deliberately swept a shattered crystal glass aside, clearing a space. He laid the manila envelope down and opened it, extracting a stack of dense legal documents. The initial receiver order Agent Sterling presented earlier froze your corporate accounts. Kensington explained, his voice steady, despite the approaching chaos outside. However, given the sudden escalation tonight, the attempted destruction of evidence, the physical assault on a federal officer, and the flight risk posed by the complete collapse of your domestic assets, further action is required immediately. He unscrewed the cap of the silver fountain pen. The metallic click echoed sharply in the tense silence of the room. "I am currently signing a federal emergency detention warrant," Kensington announced. He leaned over the sticky bar counter, pressing the nib of the pen to the paper. The harsh scratching sound of metal on parchment filled the air. It was a precise, deliberate noise. It sounded exactly like the heavy steel bolt of a prison cell sliding permanently into place. He signed the first page, flipped to the second, and signed again. "This warrant authorizes the immediate apprehension and indefinite detention of Richard Sterling, Vivian Sterling, and Harper Sterling Jefferson without bail," Kensington stated, pausing his signature to look directly at my father. "You are officially deemed a flight risk and an active threat to an ongoing federal investigation." He signed the final page and capped the pen, replacing it in his pocket. He picked up the freshly signed warrants and held them out. The legal maneuvering, the offshore shell games, the political bribes. "It all ends right here," Richard the judge declared, handing the documents to me. "The law has finally caught up with you." I took the warrants from the judge. The heavy paper felt like justice made tangible. The final loophole had been closed. There were no more extensions, no more stays of execution, and no more dirty bargains. The full weight of the United States justice system had just crashed down upon the Sterling Empire. The heavy oak doors of the grand entryway suddenly shuddered violently. The sound of heavy boots hitting the front portico signaled the arrival of the tactical teams. My father stared at the signed warrants in my hand. His chest heaved. He looked toward the barricaded front doors, then at the shattered terrace windows leading to the expansive backyard. The fight had drained from him, but the instinct for self-preservation remained a powerful, primal force. He realized the legal avenues were entirely blocked. His only remaining option was a desperate physical escape. The heavy oak doors of the grand entryway shuddered under the forceful impact of a battering ram. The loud booming sound echoed through the cavernous foyer, carrying a clear message of impending ruin. Law enforcement had arrived, and they were no longer waiting for an invitation. My father stood frozen for a fraction of a second. The distinguished veneer of the Greenwich billionaire peeled away, revealing the primal panicked instinct of a cornered fugitive. He looked at the trembling oak doors, then cast a wild glance over his shoulder. His eyes locked onto the floor-to-ceiling glass panels that lined the rear of the ballroom. Beyond the transparent barrier lay the sprawling, manicured lawns of the estate, stretching out toward the private helipad. Sitting on the concrete pad bathed in the soft glow of landscape lighting was his corporate helicopter. It was a sleek, dark machine representing his ultimate escape hatch, a fueled aircraft ready to carry him across state lines and far away from federal jurisdiction. Survival eclipsed every other loyalty he possessed. He did not look at my mother, who was still weeping near the velvet drapes. He did not spare a single glance for Harper, who was watching him with wide, terrified eyes. The man who demanded absolute devotion from his family was abandoning them without a second thought to save his own skin. He lunged toward the rear of the room. A young catering waiter, paralyzed by the escalating chaos, happened to be standing in his direct path, holding a silver tray of discarded champagne flutes. "Move," Richard roared. He did not wait for the young man to step aside. He drove his shoulder hard into the waiter chest, shoving him out of the way with brutal force. The waiter lost his footing and crashed backward into a cocktail table. The silver tray flipped, sending glassware shattering across the marble tiles. My father ignored the crash and kept running. He hit the heavy brass handles of the terrace doors, throwing his entire body weight against them. The glass doors swung open outward, letting in a sudden rush of cool night air. He stumbled out onto the stone patio, his breathing ragged and loud. Harper let out a raw, desperate scream from the center of the ballroom. "Dad!" She shrieked, her voice tearing at the edges. "Dad, wait! Do not leave me here!" He did not turn around. He did not pause. He sprinted off the edge of the stone patio and hit the damp grass. His expensive leather dress shoes slipped on the evening dew, but he scrambled to keep his balance, fighting gravity and age. He ran with a clumsy, frantic gait, his tuxedo jacket flapping wildly behind him in the wind. Judge Kensington stepped forward, his brow furrowed in disgust. He watched the disgraced executive flee across the expansive lawn. "Should we send the security detail after him?" The judge asked, his tone reflecting a deep contempt for the cowardice on display. I stood my ground near the edge of the dance floor. I did not raise a hand to signal a pursuit. I did not shout for anyone to stop him. I simply lifted my left wrist and checked the face of my watch. The second hand swept past the 12. "Let him run," I said, my voice steady and unbothered. I walked at a measured pace toward the open terrace doors. The cool breeze whipped stray strands of hair across my face, but I kept my eyes fixed on the retreating figure of my father. He was halfway across the great lawn, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the impending federal breach. The silhouette of the helicopter loomed ahead of him, a dark beacon of false hope. I stopped at the threshold where the marble ballroom met the outdoor patio. I took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air and projected my voice into the night. "Keep running, Richard," I called out. The acoustics of the open estate carried my words clearly across the manicured grass. My father faltered for a brief moment, but pushed himself harder, pumping his arms as he neared the edge of the concrete helipad. He reached the side of the sleek aircraft and grabbed the handle of the pilot door, yanking it open. He scrambled inside, pulling himself up into the leather cockpit seat. "Run all the way to the pilot seat." I continued speaking loud enough to ensure my voice reached the open cabin door of the aircraft. "But you might have a rather difficult time getting airborne if you plan to fly without an ignition harness." Inside the dark cockpit, my father froze. His hands, which had been frantically searching the instrument panel, stopped moving. I leaned against the brass doorframe, watching the realization settle over him from 100 feet away. "You spend so much time moving numbers on a spreadsheet, you forgot how the physical world operates," I stated, projecting my voice over the rising wail of the approaching sirens. "When the Department of Justice issues a federal asset freeze, they do not just lock your bank accounts. They coordinate with every relevant regulatory agency to ensure all avenues of evasion are sealed." My father slowly leaned out of the open helicopter door, his face a pale blur in the dim landscape lighting. "The Federal Aviation Administration revoked your flight clearance at exactly 7 o'clock this evening." I explained, my tone clinical and precise. "They flagged this specific tail number, rendering it illegal for any pilot to lift off from this pad. But the federal prosecutor assigned to this case is a thorough man. He knew a revoked license would not stop a desperate fugitive." I took one step out onto the stone patio. "United States Marshals secured that aircraft 2 hours ago," Richard Pfeffer revealed, delivering the final crushing blow to his escape plan. "They breached the perimeter while you were busy drinking vintage champagne and shaking hands with the people you robbed. They drained the primary fuel lines and removed the electronic starter mechanisms from the engine block. That machine is nothing but a heavy, expensive lawn ornament." My father slumped against the doorframe of the helicopter. The frantic energy that had propelled him across the lawn evaporated, leaving him hollow and defeated. He looked at the control panel, then stared out across the dark expanse of his property. The high stone walls surrounding the estate, which he had erected to keep the world out, had now become the boundaries of his own private prison. As the truth of his grounded status sank in, the ambient noise of the night was suddenly drowned out by a deafening mechanical roar. The heavy oak doors at the front of the mansion finally gave way, splintering inward with a tremendous crash. But the assault was not just happening inside. The perimeter of the estate was swarming. Dozens of police cruisers, unmarked federal vehicles, and armored tactical trucks flooded the long, winding driveway. They swerved onto the front portico and surrounded the flanks of the massive house. The deafening chorus of screaming sirens bounced off the brick facade, shaking the very foundation of the property. Then came the lights. A blinding onslaught of red and blue strobes ignited the night. The intense tactical lights pierced the darkness, sweeping across the expansive lawns and cutting through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the ballroom. The flashing beams bathed the ruined Gala in a chaotic, frantic glow, alternating between harsh crimson and stark sapphire. Standing out by the helipad, my father was caught in the sweeping beams. The red and blue lights flashed across his pale, defeated face, illuminating the utter ruin of his existence. There was nowhere left to run. The sky was closed. The gates were breached. The money was gone. He slowly lowered himself from the cockpit of the disabled helicopter. His tailored trousers brushed against the damp concrete pad. He stood for a long moment, surrounded by the relentless flashing strobes, looking like a ghost haunting his own graveyard. With slow, defeated steps, he turned away from the useless aircraft and began the long walk back across the wet grass toward the terrace. His shoulders were slumped, his head bowed. The arrogant titan who had demanded absolute obedience was returning to face the consequences he had spent a lifetime avoiding. I stepped back inside the ballroom, leaving the terrace doors open to the night air. Inside, the tactical teams were pouring through the main foyer. Agents in dark tactical gear carrying heavy equipment cases and securing the perimeter moved with practiced efficiency. They spread out across the ground floor, blocking every exit and securing the remaining guests who had failed to escape in time. My father stepped through the glass doors and back onto the marble floor. His shoes left wet grass stains on the pristine tiles. He walked past me without making eye contact, his gaze fixed firmly on the ground. He moved toward the shadowy alcove where Vivian and Harper were still huddled together. His wife and his golden child looked up at him, their faces streaked with ruined makeup and sheer terror. He had just tried to abandon them to save himself, and they knew it. The profound betrayal hung in the air between them, a silent wedge that could never be repaired. They were trapped. The law had formed an impenetrable barbed wire fence around them, sealing every possible exit. The Sterling family was finally forced to stand together, not in triumph, but in disgrace. But a man who has operated on manipulation for decades does not surrender his ego quietly, even when the handcuffs are inches away. As the federal agents began to converge on their corner of the ballroom, my father straightened his posture one last time. He looked at his weeping wife, his terrified daughter, and then he turned his dark, venomous gaze toward me. He was preparing to launch the final psychological weapon he possessed, attempting to shift the blame and rewrite the history of this night before the cell doors closed. The perimeter of the ballroom was secure. Federal agents in tactical gear formed an unyielding physical barrier across every exit. The chaotic energy of the riot had subsided, replaced by the chilling, methodical hum of law enforcement taking control. My father, Richard, stood cornered near the shattered remnants of the ice sculpture. Vivian and Harper cowered just behind him, their opulent gowns stained with spilled wine and their social armor completely fractured. The escape routes were severed, the assets were frozen, the political leverage was handcuffed. Yet even as the tactical team moved forward with zip ties ready, Richard Sterling refused to accept the reality of his own making. He squared his shoulders, attempting to summon the patriarchal authority that had governed our family for 3 decades. If he could not escape the federal charges, he would attempt to rewrite the emotional narrative of his downfall. He would frame himself as the victim of a vindictive, ungrateful child. It was the ultimate psychological gambit, designed to inflict maximum collateral damage on my conscience before he was dragged away in chains. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a toxic mixture of panic and deep-seated malice. "Look at what you have done, Chloe," he shouted, his voice echoing harshly against the marble walls. His tone was not defensive. It was accusatory, brimming with righteous indignation. "Look at the destruction you brought into this house." He gestured wildly to the ruined ballroom, to the terrified remaining guests, and finally to his weeping wife and daughter. "We gave you life," he declared, stepping forward as if physical proximity could force me to absorb his manufactured guilt. "We put a roof over your head. We provided for you. And this is how you repay your own blood. You orchestrate a public spectacle. You tear down the empire that fed you. You ruin your mother reputation. You destroy your sister marriage." Vivian, emboldened by his aggressive stance, crawled to her feet. Her face was streaked with running mascara, but her glare was lethal. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "You are a monster, Chloe," Vivian hissed, her voice cracking with forced anguish. "You are cold and heartless. You always were. You let your petty jealousy fester for 8 years, and now you have burned your own family to the ground just to satisfy your sick desire for revenge." Harper, sobbing loudly behind them, nodded in frantic agreement. "You destroyed us," she wailed, clutching her torn sapphire gown. "You ruined everything." It was a masterclass in gaslighting. They stood amidst the wreckage of a massive financial fraud, surrounded by federal evidence of embezzlement, offshore money laundering, and political extortion. Yet they stood shoulder to shoulder, insisting that the true crime committed tonight was my lack of family loyalty. They demanded I shoulder the blame for the consequences of their actions. They wanted me to feel the crushing weight of their impending incarceration. The few remaining guests, wealthy investors who had not managed to slip past the federal blockade, stopped murmuring. They watched the exchange closely. The elite crowd was accustomed to fierce boardroom battles and ruthless corporate takeovers, but witnessing a family execute a psychological firing squad in real time was a different spectacle entirely. Some of them hesitated, their expressions flickering with uncertainty. The Sterling performance was polished, and for a brief moment the narrative hung in the balance. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice in defense. I did not scramble to justify my actions or list the grievances of my childhood. Engaging in a screaming match would only validate their attempt to frame this as a domestic dispute rather than a federal takedown. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward, bridging the gap until I stood just a few feet from the cornered trio. The red and blue strobe lights from the police cruisers outside pulsed rhythmically across the floor, casting long, shifting shadows between us. I looked at my mother, then at my sister, and finally locked eyes with my father. The cold, hyper-focused calm that had guided me through the entire operation crystallized into absolute certainty. I let the silence stretch, allowing their desperate accusations to hang in the chilled air until they sounded hollow and pathetic. "I did not destroy this family, Richard," I stated, my voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register that demanded the attention of every person in the room. "I did not touch your corporate accounts. I did not forge digital signatures. I did not route $50 million of working-class pension funds into Cayman shell companies to buy fractional jet leases and diamond necklaces." I turned my gaze to Vivian, who shrank back slightly under the intensity of my stare. "I did not use a children's charity to launder money to cover underground gambling debts." I continued, my tone devoid of a single ounce of pity. "I did not leverage this $10 million estate until the bank foreclosed on the front door." I looked back at my father, delivering the final undeniable truth. "Your greed destroyed this family," I said, enunciating every syllable with surgical precision. "Your arrogance built the pyre. Your vanity poured the gasoline. I did not write the script for your downfall. I simply arrived to deliver the final invoice." The words landed with staggering impact. They stripped away the emotional manipulation, dissecting the situation into cold, undeniable facts. My father opened his mouth to formulate a rebuttal, but the momentum had entirely shifted. The tactical agents moved in, closing the circle. The illusion was dead. From the crowd of detained investors, a voice broke the silence. It was the retired manufacturing CEO, the man who had lost his life savings. "You are pathetic, Richard." The man spat, his voice thick with disgust. The sentiment rippled through the remaining guests. The elite crowd who had tolerated my parents' arrogance for decades turned on them in an instant. The murmurs erupted into loud vocal condemnation. Disgusted scoffs and angry jeers filled the ballroom. The socialites and business moguls actively turned their backs, expressing their profound contempt for the disgraced family. The sterling name was officially toxic. My father looked at the hostile crowd, his face crumpling as he realized his final psychological manipulation had failed spectacularly. He had lost the audience, he had lost the narrative, and more importantly, he had lost me. The guilt he tried to force onto my shoulders dissolved into the ether. I felt nothing but the clean, sharp edge of justice served. The time for talking was over. The time for the steel cuffs had arrived. The hostile jeers from the former investors echoed sharply against the vaulted ceiling. My father stood trembling amidst the debris of the shattered ice sculpture. The defiant patriarch was gone. The man who had spent his life dictating the terms of every engagement now had absolutely no control over the events unfolding around him. The crowd had turned. The exits were blocked. The leverage was gone. I raised my left wrist, checking the luminous dial of my watch. The second hand swept past the 12. It was exactly 9:00 p.m. The heavy oak double doors of the grand foyer did not just open. They burst inward with a tremendous concussive boom that silenced the angry murmurs of the remaining guests. A coordinated strike team of federal agents clad in dark tactical gear, bearing the bold yellow letters of the FBI across their tactical vests, flooded into the opulent space. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. There was no hesitation, no polite inquiries, and no regard for the velvet ropes or the scattered floral arrangements. They were a blunt instrument of federal law executing a meticulously planned takedown. The lead agent, a tall man with a severe expression scanning the room, locked eyes with me. I gave a single sharp nod, confirming the primary targets were secured. The team converged on the cornered trio. Richard Sterling, the lead agent, barked his voice, cutting through the ambient noise like a serrated blade. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, and federal extortion." My father did not fight back. The fight had been entirely drained from him. As the tactical agent grabbed his arm and spun him roughly around, forcing his wrists behind his back, Richard simply sagged. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly in the quiet space. It was a cold, unforgiving sound. It was the sound of a man exchanging a $10 million mansion for an 8x10 concrete cell. "Vivian Sterling, you are under arrest for money laundering and fraud," a second agent announced, stepping toward my mother. Vivian let out a piercing, horrified shriek. She recoiled, scrambling backward until her ruined silk gown caught on the edge of a shattered cocktail table. "Do not touch me!" she screamed, her voice shrill and panicked. "You cannot do this! I know the mayor! I know the governor!" The agent ignored her frantic name dropping. He seized her arms with practiced force, ignoring her flailing resistance. The steel cuffs locked around her wrists, pinning them tightly behind her back. The elegant society matron was reduced to a sobbing, hysterical mess, struggling vainly against the unyielding grip of federal law enforcement. Harper, who had been weeping silently on the floor near her mother, was pulled abruptly to her feet. A female agent secured her wrists, reciting the Miranda rights in a brisk, clinical monotone. The golden child, the immaculate heiress, looked completely bewildered. The pristine facade she had curated for decades was smeared with running mascara and the grim reality of her impending incarceration. Across the room near the terrace doors, another scenario was playing out. Marcus Jefferson stood quietly, hands raised, clearly displaying his submission. An agent approached him, securing his wrists with flex cuffs rather than steel. Marcus was not being treated with the same aggressive force as the Sterlings. He was being escorted out not as a primary target, but as a cooperating federal witness. He caught my eye as they led him toward the service elevator, offering a tight, grim nod. He had traded his freedom for his testimony, ensuring the final nails in the Sterling coffin were securely hammered into place. The elite guests, who had demanded my head just an hour prior, watched the arrests in stunned silence. The sheer brutality of the federal takedown occurring amidst the luxurious backdrop of the birthday gala was profoundly jarring, but self-preservation quickly overrode their shock. As the agents began marching the handcuffed Sterlings toward the main entrance, the remaining VYPs realized the implications. The flashing lights outside were not just tactical teams. The local media vans had undoubtedly intercepted the dispatch chatter. The press was swarming the perimeter. A sudden, frantic stampede erupted. The wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites abandoned their dignity entirely. They shoved past one another, scrambling toward the rear service exits, and the catering corridors desperate to avoid the glaring camera flashes and the inevitable front-page photographs documenting their association with the disgraced family. Within minutes, the mass exodus was complete. The tactical teams cleared the ballroom, marching my father, mother, and sister out the front doors and into the waiting armored transport vehicles. The heavy steel doors of the transport slammed shut, sealing their fate. The opulent ballroom, which had cost $85,000 to decorate for a single evening, was entirely deserted. It looked like the aftermath of a localized hurricane. The pristine white linens were stained with spilled burgundy wine. Shattered crystal dotted the marble floor, catching the ambient light. Crushed peonies and ruined hors d'oeuvres were scattered everywhere. I stood alone in the center of the devastation, the oppressive weight that had rested on my shoulders for 8 long years, the constant hum of anxiety, the need to prove my innocence, the suffocating shadow of their lies. It was all gone. The silence in the ruined mansion was profound. It was not the heavy, tense silence of a family dinner waiting for the inevitable explosion. It was the clean, empty silence of a slate wiped completely clean. I looked at the shattered ice sculpture. I looked at the dark, empty terrace. I looked at the spot where my father had stood, demanding my obedience. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath, pulling the cool night air deep into my lungs. I exhaled, releasing the ghosts of my past into the empty room. I opened my eyes, adjusted the lapels of my tailored suit, and turned toward the exit. The job was finished. It was time to leave the wreckage behind and step into the unburdened future I had built for myself. 6 months later, the heavy wooden doors of a federal courtroom in Manhattan swung shut. The echo bounced off the marble walls, finalizing the destruction of the Sterling Empire. I sat in the second row of the gallery watching the conclusion of the legal process. The man sitting at the defense table bore little resemblance to the arrogant billionaire who had slapped me at a birthday gala. Richard Sterling wore a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit. His wrists were secured to a heavy chain wrapped tightly around his waist. He looked frail, stripped of the bespoke suits and the intimidating bluster that had defined his entire existence. The presiding magistrate did not waste time with pleasantries. The judge read the sentence with a cold, clinical precision. Richard was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The charges listed on the official record included wire fraud, securities manipulation, and orchestrating a complex money laundering syndicate. When the gavel struck the sounding block, Richard did not look back at the gallery. He stared blankly at the polished surface of the defense table. His posture was hollow. He had finally realized that his wealth could not buy a reversal of time. His accomplices met equally grim fates. Vivian attempted to leverage her remaining social connections to negotiate a lenient plea agreement. She spent weeks calling her high society peers, begging for character references and financial support. She quickly discovered that the elite circles of Greenwich possess a very short memory regarding disgraced members. Her former friends ignored her calls. The federal prosecutors showed zero leniency regarding the charity fraud. She received an 8-year sentence. The proud society matron was relocated to a minimum security facility in Danbury, permanently stripped of her diamond earrings and her hollow prestige. Harper faced the harshest psychological reality check. She could no longer hide behind her father influence or her husband competence. The offshore accounts bearing her name provided irrefutable evidence of her direct involvement in the embezzlement. The judge sentenced her to 12 years. I attended one of her preliminary hearings out of professional curiosity. Harper walked into the courtroom shuffling in state-issued canvas shoes. She glanced at me from across the aisle. Her eyes lacked the old venom. They only held the vacant, terrified stare of someone who finally understood the crushing cost of arrogance. Marcus Jefferson honored his cooperation agreement. His encrypted flash drive gave the Department of Justice the exact roadmap they needed to bypass years of tedious litigation. The immunity deal kept him out of a prison cell, but the corporate world deemed him a permanent liability. He relocated to the Midwest, taking a mid-level management position at a regional logistics firm. He traded his ambition for his freedom. It was a fair exchange, considering he narrowly avoided spending decades behind bars. The true victory did not happen inside the courtroom. It happened inside the accounting ledgers. The receiver mandate allowed my federal team to systematically liquidate the seized assets. We dissolved the Cayman shell companies, repatriated the offshore funds, and auctioned off the fractional jet leases. The millions recovered were channeled directly into a victim restitution fund. The retired manufacturing executive who had assaulted my father at the Gala received a certified letter last month. It contained a federal check restoring his stolen pension. The teachers' union, the municipal workers, and the private investors saw their portfolios stabilized. The financial bleeding stopped. The damage was repaired not by magic, but by meticulous forensic tracing. Securing justice for those victims was the only closure I required. With the Sterling case officially closed, I submitted my formal resignation to the federal agency. I had accomplished what I set out to do. It was time to build something entirely my own. I opened an independent forensic auditing firm based in downtown Manhattan. I kept my surname, calling the company Sterling Financial Forensics. I did not keep the name as a badge of honor. I kept it as a warning to prospective targets. My firm specializes in uncovering corporate malfeasance. We are hired by board members, whistleblowers, and regulatory bodies to dismantle fraudulent enterprises before they collapse the open market. My office overlooks the financial district. It features glass walls and open floor plans. There are no dark corners and no locked drawers holding forged documents. Transparency is the only currency we accept. I built a fortress of accountability to replace the house of lies I grew up in. Yesterday afternoon, I had a client meeting in Connecticut. On my way back to the city, I took a deliberate detour through Greenwich. I steered my car down the familiar winding road lined with ancient oak trees. I pulled over near the rusted iron gates of my former childhood home. The estate was unrecognizable. Vanguard National Bank had taken physical possession the morning after the gala. The property had sat vacant for 6 months, embroiled in administrative red tape and municipal zoning disputes. The manicured lawns where my mother once hosted lavish garden parties were overgrown and wild. Tall weeds choked the imported rose bushes. The grand driveway was cracked and littered with dead leaves. A stark white foreclosure sign was hammered brutally into the front lawn. The elegant facade was peeling, revealing the rotting wood underneath. The house looked like a decaying monument to unchecked greed. It was a physical representation of the toxic illusion that once held my family together. The walls had fallen, and nature was reclaiming the dirt. I rolled down my car window and let the crisp afternoon air fill the cabin. I looked at the dark, empty windows of the ballroom where the financial riot had taken place. I searched my chest for any lingering sorrow. I found none. I shed no tears for the people who used to live there. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the titan who lost his crown or the mother who traded her daughter for social status. I only felt a profound, endless sense of freedom. The heavy, suffocating expectations, the constant demand to absorb their blame, the fear of their retaliation. It was all gone. The air felt lighter. The world felt infinitely larger. I was no longer carrying the weight of their sins. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the rotting estate in my rearview mirror. I merged onto the highway, heading back toward the city and the life I built with my own 2 hands. I did not look back. People often ask me if I regret orchestrating the downfall of my own blood. They wonder if the cost was too high. Society tends to view family as an unbreakable bond requiring unconditional loyalty regardless of the abuse inflicted. They believe you should protect your relatives at all costs. Loyalty is a reciprocal agreement. When a family demands your silence to protect their crimes, they cease being a family. They become a syndicate. You owe nothing to people who view your integrity as a liability. If you are listening to this and you recognize the signs, I want you to remember something crucial. Never let anyone force you to shrink yourself to protect their perfect facade. Do not absorb the blame for mistakes you did not make. Do not dim your light so they can pretend their darkness does not exist. You are not a human shield for their incompetence. Walking away is the first step toward reclaiming your life. Speaking the truth is the second. When you stand up to manipulators, they will try to change the narrative. They will call you crazy. They will call you vindictive. They will tell the world you are trying to destroy them out of spite. Let them talk. Let them spin their frantic, desperate stories. Hold your ground and present the receipts. Expose the truth boldly and without hesitation. The truth is not revenge. The truth is justice. And justice is the only foundation solid enough to build a new life upon. I am Chloe Sterling. I am 32 years old. I survived the fire my family started, and I used the ashes to build an empire of my own. Thank you for listening to my story. If this message resonated with you, share your experience in the comments below. Never compromise your worth for people who refuse to see it. Stay strong, and always keep the receipts. I stand by the floor-to-ceiling window of my Manhattan office. The city moves far below me, a grid of endless transactions, negotiations, and silent battles. For a very long time, my life was just another bad deal, managed by people who thought they owned my ledger. Now I hold the pen. The air in my office is quiet. There is no shouting, no frantic scrambling to cover up yesterday's mistakes. Surviving the Sterling family collapse taught me more about human behavior than any forensic accounting degree ever could. When you dismantle an empire built on deception, you walk away with deep scars, but you also walk away with profound clarity. The wreckage left behind offered 3 vital truths. First, biological ties do not guarantee loyalty. They merely provide a convenient disguise for exploitation. Toxic individuals view family members strictly as assets or liabilities. If you are not actively serving their curated narrative, you quickly become a scapegoat. I spent years waiting for parental protection that was never coming because I was too busy functioning as their human shield. True loyalty is reciprocal. It does not demand your destruction to ensure someone else's survival. You owe nothing to people who treat your existence as a disposable resource. Second power, rooted in deceit, is remarkably fragile. My father commanded rooms, dictated terms, and crushed opponents using the sheer weight of his reputation. He projected an aura of invincibility that paralyzed everyone around him. But a reputation funded by stolen pensions and offshore shell games is just paper waiting for a spark. True power does not require screaming physical intimidation or expensive suits. True power is walking into a hostile room, holding undeniable evidence, and watching the illusion suffocate under the weight of empirical data. Always keep the receipts. Data does not lie, and it does not flinch under pressure. Third, establishing real boundaries sometimes requires leveling the old house to the ground. You cannot negotiate with people who profit from your pain. My mother offered me a seat on a sinking ship disguised as a maternal peace offering. Accepting that bribe would have meant participating in my own erasure. Healing required me to stop hoping for their sudden redemption and start orchestrating my own justice. You have to be willing to watch their house collapse so you can clear the plot and pour your own concrete. You cannot build a healthy future on a foundation of lies. I look at the framed federal credential resting on my glass desk. It is a quiet daily reminder that justice is not something handed to you by a benevolent universe. You have to extract it yourself. If you are sitting in the dark right now wondering if you possess the strength to confront the architects of your misery, know that you do. The truth is your heaviest weapon. Pick it up and swing it hard. Thank you for walking through this journey with me today. Your time and attention mean everything. If my fight resonated with your own struggles, hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories for more narratives about survival, exposing the truth, and taking back your power. Until next time, stay sharp, guard your peace, and never let anyone else write your ending.